Old Hollywood liked to sell itself as a family business, dashing leading men and glowing ingenues who'd been discovered, nurtured, and polished into stars by people who loved them. Dig into the British corner of that industry specifically: the London stage kids, the wartime radio prodigies, the West End transplants who ended up on MGM contracts, and a much colder pattern starts showing up in court records, memoirs, and biographies written decades after the fact. Parents who saw a paycheck before they saw a child, guardians who controlled every dollar a kid ever earned and never let go of it, long after any legal or moral justification for that control had expired. Households that left permanent damage long after the cameras stopped rolling and the lights on set went dark for the night, damage that in several of these cases the stars themselves only found the words to describe decades later, once they were finally in a position to write their own account instead of having someone else write it for them. Stories like these are exactly why it's worth sticking around and hitting subscribe. Here are 10 of the cruelest parents and parental figures connected to old Hollywood's British contingent, and the documented damage they left behind long after the applause had stopped. Number 1. The parents of Freddie Bartholomew. Freddie Bartholomew was born in London in March 1924, and according to multiple biographical accounts, including his own later remarks in interviews, his parents, Cecil and Lillian Bartholomew, showed little genuine interest in raising him almost from the moment he was born. He was handed off first to his paternal grandparents for a short stretch, and then permanently to his father's sister, Millicent, known to Freddie and later to the entire world as Aunt Sissy, who raised him from infancy in the small English town of Warminster as though he were her own son. It was Sissy, not his birth parents, who first put him on stage reciting poetry at church socials at the age of 3, who found him small roles in early British film productions through the 1930s, and who eventually made the decision to take him all the way to Hollywood in 1934 to audition for MGM's adaptation of David Copperfield. His birth parents had no involvement in any part of that journey, no hand in the auditions, the training, or the years of unglamorous groundwork that came before the fame. When Bartholomew landed the title role in David Copperfield, he became an overnight sensation almost literally within weeks of the film's release, and the film's massive commercial success led directly to a 7-year MGM contract, a permanent move to America, and a rapid climb in salary that eventually made him the second highest paid child actor in the entire country, trailing only Shirley Temple. Cecil and Lillian, a couple Freddie barely knew by that point, having had almost no meaningful contact with him for years, suddenly reappeared once his name started showing up in newspapers alongside genuinely large dollar figures. In April 1936, following the massive success of Little Lord Fauntleroy, they filed a formal petition in the Superior Court of Los Angeles County, seeking to nullify Sissy's legal guardianship entirely and claim direct custody of both Freddie and a substantial share of his growing fortune. Lillian gave interviews to the press during this period, complaining publicly that she hadn't heard from her son and had been unable to reach him by letter or telephone, conveniently omitting from every one of those interviews the fact that she had shown essentially no interest in raising him at all before he became commercially valuable to the family. The court denied the parents' initial petition to nullify Sissy's guardianship outright, but the legal fighting was far from over. Attorneys for both sides spent months negotiating a compromise that was finally approved by a judge in June 1936, carving Freddie's earnings into fixed percentages, with a portion reserved in trust for Freddie himself, 10% directed permanently to his father, and 5% portions carved out for each of his 2 teenage sisters, essentially guaranteeing an ongoing cut of a child's labor to relatives who had played no role whatsoever in earning it. The financial strain of the ongoing legal battle became so severe that Sissy was forced to demand a substantial raise from MGM in the summer of 1937, leveraging the massive box office success of Captain's Courageous to negotiate a new contract worth $2,000 a week just to keep the family financially afloat, while lawyers on both sides continued billing by the hour. The overall legal fight stretched on for close to 7 years in total, according to multiple biographical accounts, consuming what Bartholomew himself later described as the majority of the fortune he had earned, as one of the most famous child actors on the entire planet during the back half of the 1930s. By his own account given years later, in interviews reflecting back on his career, most of what he made as a boy simply disappeared into legal fees generated by 2 parents who had abandoned him as an infant and only remembered they had a son once that son started making headlines and generating box office receipts. Number 2. Lady May Lawford, mother of Peter Lawford. Peter Lawford grew up the only surviving child of Sir Sidney Lawford, a decorated British Army general, and his wife, known throughout her life as Lady May, a woman multiple biographers, most notably James Spada in his detailed biography of the actor, have described as domineering, eccentric, and controlling in ways that shaped her son's entire adult psychology for the rest of his life. According to accounts drawn from Lawford's own later interviews, Lady May had endured several previous pregnancy losses before Peter was finally born, and upon finally having a child who survived infancy, she became fixated on protecting him in ways that manifested as deeply unusual, and by most accounts genuinely damaging, control over his early childhood. By multiple accounts, she dressed him in girl's clothing and kept his hair grown out long, well past the age at which that would have been considered ordinary even by the more relaxed standards of the era, reportedly out of a superstitious belief that presenting him publicly as a girl in his earliest years would somehow shield him from the same fate that had claimed her previous children. She kept him largely isolated from other children his own age throughout much of his boyhood, educating him almost entirely through private tutors rather than allowing him the ordinary socialization of a real school environment, a decision Lawford later said left him profoundly unprepared for peer relationships and painfully lonely throughout much of his adolescence, a gap he said he spent years actively trying to compensate for once he finally began building an independent social life in Hollywood as a young adult. As his film career developed and eventually flourished, first in Britain in small roles and then in the United States under contract to MGM, Lady May inserted herself directly and repeatedly into his finances, and by several biographical accounts took an ongoing, substantial cut of his earnings well into his adulthood, continuing to treat her fully grown son's income as something she remained personally entitled to draw from, rather than something that belonged solely to him as an independent working adult. The relationship curdled further as Lawford's personal life became increasingly public, particularly following his 1954 marriage into the Kennedy family through Patricia Kennedy, a marriage that placed him at the center of American political glamour almost overnight. Lady May gave a series of unflattering interviews about her own son to the press in the years that followed that marriage, publicly criticizing both his choice of wife and his broader lifestyle in ways that visibly embarrassed him in front of the American public, at a moment when his professional standing was tied directly to his association with a rising and image-conscious political dynasty. Lawford, who spent his final years battling severe alcoholism and addiction before his death in 1984, at the age of 61, rarely spoke warmly of his upbringing in later interviews, consistently describing a childhood defined by control, isolation, and a mother who viewed him as an extension of her own unmet needs rather than as a separate person entitled to an ordinary boyhood of his own, a stark private contrast to the smooth, effortlessly charming Rat Pack image audiences associated with him for decades on movie screens and Las Vegas stages alike. Diana Dors and her mother Mary Fluck. Diana Dors, born Diana Fluck in Swindon, England, in October 1931, went on to become Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe by her early 20s. A glamorous blonde bombshell who dominated British tabloids for the better part of 3 decades and became one of the country's first genuine sex symbols in the post-war era. Her path there started remarkably young, and by most biographical accounts, including her own later memoirs, it started specifically because her mother pushed it in that direction, with an intensity that left little room for Diana's own preferences or pace. Mary Fluck enrolled her daughter in local talent competitions and beauty pageants from a very early age, and Dors wrote candidly in her own autobiography, Dors by Diana, that her mother lied about her age on multiple documented occasions specifically to get her into pageants and modeling opportunities designed for older teenagers. Entering a girl of just 13 into competitions meant for young women several years her senior in order to fast-track her toward commercial success. Dors described feeling, even as a young girl, like a product being carefully managed, rather than a child simply being raised, recalling her mother's ambitions for her as relentless and frequently indifferent to whether Diana herself actually wanted the constant public attention being arranged on her behalf, week after week. As her career accelerated through her mid-teens, culminating in a place at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art at just 14 years old, remarkably young even by the standards of the era's stage schools, the pressure to perform, to maintain a certain look, and to generate steady income for the family only intensified, with Dors later saying plainly that her childhood had effectively ended the moment her mother recognized she had genuine commercial potential and decided to capitalize on it as thoroughly and as quickly as possible. The pattern set during Dors's adolescence echoed forward into much of her adult life, where she was repeatedly exploited financially by a string of husbands and managers, a vulnerability multiple biographers have directly traced back to a childhood in which she was never taught to see her own worth as separate from what she could earn for the people managing her. Dors died of ovarian cancer in May 1984 at just 52 years old, having spent decades as one of Britain's most instantly recognizable stars while privately describing, in her own published words, a mother who had come to see her less as a daughter and more as an investment that had finally, after years of pageants and coaching, started paying real dividends. Number 4. Ted Andrews, stepfather of Julie Andrews. Julie Andrews laid out one of the most disturbing accounts on this entire list herself. In her own words, in her 2008 memoir Home, a memoir of my early years. Her mother, Barbara, divorced her biological father when Julie was still young and soon remarried a Canadian-born English music hall performer named Ted Andrews, a man who helped train Julie's remarkable 4-octave voice and helped launch her into a professional singing career while she was still a small child, performing on stages across wartime and immediate post-war Britain to entertain audiences living through genuine national crisis, including a memorable Royal Command performance while she was still a young teenager. Andrews wrote in her memoir about a stepfather who developed a severe, steadily worsening drinking problem as she moved through her early teenage years, tied in part to the pressures of the touring performance circuit and his own frustrated ambitions. She described in specific, deliberate detail at least one incident in which Ted, heavily intoxicated, came into her bedroom late at night in a manner that deeply frightened her, an account she chose to include in the book specifically because she felt readers deserved an honest version of her childhood rather than the carefully sanitized one that had accompanied her for over 50 years as the face of Mary Poppins and Maria von Trapp. She wrote that the household during those years was defined by ongoing financial strain, her stepfather's escalating drinking, and a persistent low-grade unease that she carried with her long after she eventually left home to build an independent career on her own terms. And she noted that she began contributing financially to the family from a startlingly young age once her singing talent became commercially apparent, effectively becoming a breadwinner for a household built around 2 adults who struggled considerably to manage both their own finances and their own personal lives. Andrews has spoken publicly since the memoir's release about how genuinely difficult it was to write those particular passages, given how completely they contradicted the wholesome, nearly untouchable public image that had been built around her for decades by studios eager to protect a very specific brand of pristine, girl-next-door Englishness. She has maintained consistently that the account was accurate and that it was important to finally put it on the record in her own words rather than continue leaving it to speculation, or leave the memory of her mother and stepfather artificially polished purely for the sake of protecting her own carefully constructed image. If a story like Julie Andrews's changes how you think about the wholesome family image sold alongside her career for so long, that's kind of the whole point of pulling stories like this back out into the light after all these years. Number 5. Leslie Clark, father of Petula Clark. Petula Clark became one of Britain's most successful child performers of the Second World War, singing live on the BBC to entertain troops and bombed-out civilians from the age of just 9 years old, a genuine national morale symbol during some of the war's darkest and most uncertain stretches, reportedly requested by name during air raid broadcasts because listeners found her voice calming during genuinely terrifying nights. Behind that early career was her father, Leslie Clark, who by multiple biographical accounts functioned less like a supportive parent and more like a full-time manager, who controlled nearly every aspect of his daughter's professional and financial life well into her adulthood, long after any reasonable justification for that level of oversight had passed. Clark has spoken in numerous later interviews about how thoroughly her father managed her earnings during her childhood and teenage years, describing a working relationship in which major career and financial decisions were made entirely by her father, with little to no meaningful input from her, despite the plain fact that it was her voice, her rehearsal time, and her performing labor that was generating the family's income throughout that entire wartime and post-war period. As her career extended into her 20s and 30s, first as a major British recording star through the 1950s, and later as a genuinely internationally successful artist, thanks to global hits like Downtown in the mid-1960s, Clark had to actively and deliberately work to separate her professional identity and her personal finances from her father's continued, Ongoing involvement, describing the process in interviews across the decades as a slow, occasionally painful reclaiming of control over a career that had technically belonged to her since childhood but had rarely felt like it did in practice, given how little say she had over the decisions shaping it. The arrangement was never as extreme, as legally contested, or as publicly scandalous as some of the other cases on this list, and Clark herself has always spoken about her father with more complicated affection than outright resentment, careful to acknowledge the genuine sacrifices he made during difficult wartime years. But her own comments across decades of interviews still paint a remarkably consistent picture of a father who viewed his daughter's fame primarily through the lens of what it could reliably provide for the family as a whole, a dynamic she has said took years of deliberate, sustained effort to fully untangle even after she had become a fully grown, internationally successful recording artist entirely in her own right. Number 6. Sarah Taylor, mother of Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was born in London in February 1932 to American parents who had lived and worked in England for years before finally returning to the United States as war broke out across Europe in 1939, arriving in Hollywood as refugees of a sort just as her mother began actively pursuing a screen career for her young daughter. Her mother, Sarah Southern Taylor, had herself been a working stage actress under her maiden name before giving up that career to marry, and according to multiple biographers, including Alexander Walker's extensively researched account of Taylor's life and career, Sarah transferred her own unfulfilled theatrical ambitions directly and forcefully onto her young daughter, with an intensity that shaped virtually every aspect of Elizabeth's childhood from a remarkably early age. Biographers have documented Sarah coaching young Elizabeth extensively on techniques for producing convincing tears on command during screen tests and auditions, drilling her repeatedly in methods for summoning specific emotions instantly on cue at an age when most children were still learning basic reading skills, and maintaining unusually tight control over her daughter's diet, weight, and physical appearance once MGM's studio contract made her physical presentation a constant, closely monitored professional concern rather than simply a private matter of ordinary childhood growth and change. Taylor herself later spoke openly in multiple interviews across her adult life about growing up essentially without anything resembling a normal childhood, describing her mother as a constant, controlling presence on set and at home who treated Elizabeth's blossoming career as a fully shared project belonging equally to both of them, rather than as something that ultimately belonged solely to her daughter, a dynamic that blurred the line between mother and manager for years without ever fully resolving in Elizabeth's favor during her formative years. Taylor went on to describe in later interviews across her adult life how disorienting it eventually became to realize, well into adulthood and after multiple marriages and a fully independent career of her own, just how much of her own early sense of self had been shaped entirely around meeting her mother's expectations, rather than developing organically around her own genuine preferences and interests. A slow realization that contributed directly to a complicated, frequently strained relationship between the two women that persisted for decades, even as Sarah remained a fixture in her daughter's life and professional decisions well into Taylor's own established adult stardom, and long past the point where such involvement would typically be expected. Number 7. Charles Chaplin Sr., father of Charlie Chaplin. Before Charlie Chaplin became one of the single most famous entertainers on Earth, arguably the most recognizable face on the planet by the 1920s, he spent his early childhood in London in conditions that stand in stark, almost inverted contrast to virtually every other performer covered on this list. His father, also named Charles Chaplin, was himself a moderately successful music hall performer whose severe and steadily worsening alcoholism came to define much of his son's early years, according to Chaplin's own detailed and unflinching account in his 1964 autobiography. The elder Chaplin largely abandoned the family financially and emotionally while Charlie was still very young, leaving his mother Hannah to raise Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney essentially alone in conditions of genuine, grinding poverty across South London, a situation that cycled the family repeatedly through workhouses and charity institutions once Hannah, who suffered from serious and progressively worsening mental illness, could no longer cope on her own and was eventually formally institutionalized in an asylum. Chaplin wrote with striking candor about the periods when he and Sidney were sent to live in a workhouse specifically designated for destitute children, an outcome directly tied to the fact that their father, though alive and for stretches working steadily within the very same entertainment industry, provided the family with essentially no meaningful financial support whatsoever during those crucial years. When Charles Sr. did periodically reappear in his sons' lives, Chaplin's autobiography describes brief, consistently disappointing encounters, rather than anything resembling a sustained or reliable parental relationship. Visits that left young Charlie more confused and unsettled than genuinely comforted by his father's presence. Charles Sr. ultimately died of complications directly related to his alcoholism in 1901, when Charlie was only 12 years old, having spent the entirety of his son's childhood functionally absent from it despite living in the very same city for the vast majority of those formative years. Chaplin went on to build an entire career, and one of cinema's most enduring and beloved characters in The Tramp, out of a persona defined specifically by quiet resilience in the face of poverty, hunger, and neglect, and biographers across generations have consistently pointed directly to his own father's prolonged abandonment as the real, lived source of that material that would eventually make millions of audiences around the world laugh and weep in equal measure, without most of them ever knowing exactly where it came from. Number 8. Ernest and Gertrude Hartley, parents of Vivian Leigh. Vivian Leigh was born in Darjeeling, India in November 1913 to British parents who were living there for her father's business career in colonial finance, and at just 6 years old, her parents made the deliberate decision to send her alone across the world to a convent boarding school in England, the Sacred Heart Convent in Roehampton, while they themselves remained behind in India for several more years before eventually rejoining her back in England. According to biographer Hugo Vickers and several other accounts drawn directly from Leigh's own later recollections and interviews, the separation proved genuinely devastating for a child that young, leaving her isolated in an unfamiliar country with virtually no meaningful contact with either parent for extended, indefinite stretches of time. A disruption Leigh herself referenced repeatedly throughout her adult life as one of the single defining wounds of her early years. She would later describe elaborate imaginative games she invented with a favorite fellow student at the school, a private fantasy world that biographers have consistently suggested functioned as a coping mechanism for what was, by any reasonable standard, a genuinely lonely and disorienting childhood imposed on her entirely by parents who prioritized their own circumstances and careers in India over keeping their young daughter close during her most formative years. Leigh went on to become one of the most celebrated and honored actresses of her generation, winning 2 Academy Awards across a career that included Gone with the Wind and A Streetcar Named Desire, but she also battled severe, extensively documented mental illness throughout the whole of her adult life, eventually understood in terms that would today align closely with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, a condition further complicated by chronic tuberculosis that plagued her physically for years alongside the psychological struggles. Multiple biographers examining her full life and career have directly connected the extreme emotional volatility that came to define her later years, and the profound fragility that colleagues, including her own husband Laurence Olivier, described witnessing firsthand throughout their turbulent marriage, back to that early, prolonged childhood separation, arguing persuasively that a 6-year-old sent alone across the world by her own parents rarely emerges from that kind of rupture entirely unmarked, regardless of how much critical acclaim or professional success might follow decades later on the world's biggest stages and screens. Number 9. Lily Flynn, mother of Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn wrote about his own mother in surprisingly blunt, almost clinically detached terms in his 1959 memoir, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, describing a woman who, by his own account, showed him remarkably little genuine warmth or affection throughout his childhood in Australia and later Tasmania, where his father held an academic post. Flynn wrote that his mother, Lily, appeared to resent him almost from the moment he was born, and he recounted one specific, genuinely chilling childhood memory of nearly drowning as a young boy, while his mother, who was nearby and fully aware of what was happening in the water, reportedly made no visible effort to intervene or help him, an episode he described with a kind of flat, resigned bitterness rather than any dramatic outrage, almost as though the incident had simply confirmed something he already understood, on some level, about exactly where he stood with her in the family hierarchy. He wrote that his father, a respected and internationally recognized marine biologist who would go on to a distinguished academic career, was frequently absent pursuing his own demanding research and lecturing commitments, leaving young Errol largely under his mother's care during formative years that he described, in his own words, as marked far more by consistent coldness and sharp criticism than by anything resembling genuine affection or warmth from either parent. Flynn's own biographers have repeatedly connected this account of his early upbringing to the restless, self-destructive, and often deeply exploitative pattern that came to define much of his adult life, including his extensively documented pursuit of very young women well into his own late 40s, A pattern well outside the scope of this particular story, but one biographers have suggested points to a man who spent decades chasing forms of validation and control he had simply never received as a child growing up in that particular household. Flynn's account of his mother remains, notably, entirely self-reported, with no surviving corroborating testimony from Lily herself to confirm or dispute the specifics of what he described. But Flynn included the account quite deliberately in a memoir otherwise dedicated almost entirely to boasting about his own adventures, conquests, and professional triumphs, a detail biographers have frequently flagged as evidence of just how genuinely unresolved that particular relationship remained for him right up until his death in October 1959, the very same year the book itself was finally published for the public to read and pick apart. Number 10. Charlotte Selby, grandmother and false mother of Merle Oberon. Merle Oberon's story stands apart from every other entry on this list, because the central figure of cruelty in her life wasn't technically her parent at all, and the concealment of that fact was itself the deepest cruelty running through the entire arrangement. Oberon was born in Bombay in February 1911 to a mixed-race mother, Constance Selby, and grew up in a household almost entirely dominated by her own grandmother, Charlotte Selby, a woman biographers Charles Hyam and Roy Mosley describe in careful detail in their biography of the actress as controlling, image-obsessed, and singularly focused on the family's social advancement above nearly everything else, including her own daughter's basic dignity. As Oberon's acting career developed first in England during the early 1930s and then explosively in Hollywood through the rest of that decade, an era defined by severe, entirely explicit racial discrimination throughout every level of the film industry, Charlotte orchestrated an elaborate, sustained, decades-long deception in which she presented herself publicly as Oberon's actual mother, while Oberon's real biological mother, Constance, was forced to travel alongside her own daughter and live under the very same roof for years, all while being introduced to studio colleagues, journalists, and eventually even Oberon's own husbands as either a family servant or a distant, unrelated relative, rather than ever acknowledged as her real parent in any public or professional context. The arrangement was designed quite deliberately to hide Oberon's Anglo-Indian heritage from an industry and a broader movie-going public that would have ended her career almost instantly had the truth become widely known at the time. And it meant that Constance spent years of her own life effectively erased from her daughter's public existence, denied any public acknowledgement of the relationship whatsoever, and reportedly required at various points to formally address her own daughter as Miss Oberon whenever others were present in the room. Biographers have described the psychological toll this arrangement took on Oberon herself as genuinely immense, forcing her to maintain a lifelong public fiction about her own origins and to interact with her real mother under a completely manufactured pretense for as long as Constance remained alive, an arrangement engineered from the very start and then rigidly enforced for years afterward, entirely by Charlotte, the very grandmother who insisted on being publicly addressed as mother in her own daughter's rightful place. Oberon never publicly acknowledged the truth of either her heritage or her mother's real identity during her own lifetime, and the full account only became widely known to the public through careful biographical research published well after her death in 1979, confirming decades later just how completely one family member's personal ambition had reshaped and permanently damaged the basic truth of who had actually raised whom inside that household. 10 families, 10 very different versions of essentially the same underlying pattern, parents and parental figures who consistently saw a child's talent before they ever fully saw the child standing in front of them, whether that meant abandoning a son for years until he suddenly became profitable enough to fight over in court, controlling a daughter's finances well into her established adulthood, or building an entire decades-long deception around who a parent was even legally and socially permitted to be in public. Some of these accounts come directly from the stars themselves, laid out in their own words across memoirs and interviews given specifically, years later, to correct the public record on their own terms. Others come from biographers who spent years carefully piecing together court filings, immigration records, and studio archives long after nearly everyone directly involved had already died and could no longer offer their own side of the story. If there's a specific old Hollywood family story or a particular British star's upbringing that you think deserves this same kind of careful digging, say so in the comments below. And if this kind of deep archival breakdown is exactly the sort of thing you want more of, subscribing means you genuinely won't miss the next one.